Hello, hello. You are joining me in the greenhouse. It's a beautifully sunny day here in Inverness, but it is still quite chilly, so it's not really warm enough to sit out in the actual sun without wearing a lot of clothes. But it's definitely warm enough to sit in the greenhouse, which is nice. So I'm accompanied by my fig, which was my birthday present last year from my mother-in-law, and it's putting on loads of new leaves, which is very exciting. And all my seedlings, which are not coming through quite as quickly as I would like, if I'm honest, which is giving me the fear that maybe I've planted them too soon. It is still quite chilly at night here, like it's definitely still getting down into the minus numbers, and there has been some frost on the ground, albeit fairly light frost. But I guess I would have assumed that in the greenhouse they would have been fine. But I planted them a week ago, and I guess I would have expected to see some signs of germination by now. A few of the sweet peas are coming through, but I'd pre-germinated those seeds on my windowsill, so that's kind of not surprising, but I don't know, we'll see. I mean, worst case scenario, most of the seeds I've got more of, so I could plant another load in a couple of weeks' time. And I know some of them, off the top of my head, I can't remember which ones, parsley maybe, does take a couple of weeks to germinate, so maybe just getting ahead of myself. But yeah, I guess I was expecting, I've been coming in every day to sort of check on everything, and I guess I was expecting every day to be like, oh my goodness, more seedlings. So far I think I've had 3 sweet peas, and that's it. And I've got quite a few things planted now, so yeah, sort of thought I'd see more action, but I guess I'll report back again in a week. But the reason I wanted to record a little podcast episode today was to talk about my Hobbit Robe, because I'm very aware that I've had a couple of weeks in a row of garden chat, which, you know, I love, don't get me wrong, and it's the season, isn't it, where everybody's planting seedlings and playing around in their gardens and whatnot, so it doesn't feel inappropriate to be talking about the garden at the moment. But equally, I'm very aware that not everybody is here for the garden chat, because a lot of you joined me originally for knitting and sewing, so yeah, I thought this is a good opportunity to catch you up on the Hobbit Robe. If you haven't read the previous blog posts about it, I will definitely link it in the show notes. But this is an ongoing project. I actually, for once, did a bit of research prior to sitting down and rambling into the microphone, because I couldn't remember when I started my Hobbit Robe, and I think it was 2022, according to the blog, and also according to my email receipt for when I bought the Sew DIY improv quilting course, which is an e-course offered by Beth from Sew DIY, and it's about improvisational quilting. So rather than quilting with sort of, sorry, hiccups, I'm also drinking coffee at the same time, so you'll get some sound effects there. But yeah, rather than quilting with sort of pre-made quilting fabric, you know, like sort of fat quarters or jelly rolls, whatever that quilters use. The idea with improv quilting is you can quilt with like fabric remnants or scraps. You just need to sort them into sort of similar weights or colour palettes. And then because they're often irregular shapes, so rather than sort of pre-cutting your squares or rectangles or hexagons the way you would for a more traditional quilt, the idea with improv quilting is that you learn how to make the most of the sort of more irregular shapes, so you can basically use up all of your scraps, which in some ways is sort of more true to the original nature of quilting, right? The sort of make, do and mend, every little bit of fabric is a resource kind of history of quilting, rather than the sort of maybe more sort of commercialised modern version of quilting where you can be sort of sold kits and packs of fabric. But you know, quilting originally was obviously all about kind of making the most of the resources that you've had and kind of recycling old clothing or blankets or whatever to make new uses for them. And so I really liked the idea of Beth's improv quilting class, because I thought, well, that's perfect. Everybody who sews pretty much has fabric scraps and remnants that they don't want to get rid of, so learning how to kind of make the most of those is a great shout. So I'm pretty certain Beth will still be offering it on her website. I'll link it in the show notes, but I would definitely recommend it. It's one of these sort of step-by-step video classes that you can kind of work through in your own time and watch episodes to remind you how to do certain techniques, etc. I basically always have to re-listen to the episode about sewing circles, quilting circles, because I struggle with that. Yeah, and then around the same time, I remember finding Minimalist Machinist on Instagram. I might have been following her already, but I remember she posted this crumb quilting vest that she made. And the idea with crumb quilting is you're using up like really teeny tiny scraps. But the way Rachel was doing it was she was quilting directly onto the batting. So rather than creating your sort of quilt topper and then later on quilting it onto a batting and a backing fabric, Rachel was sewing the quilt pieces directly onto the batting. And that really appealed to me because it was quite an organic method that she was using, sort of just basically making it up as you go along rather than having too much by way of a plan, which is quite appealing. Just easier to get into that sort of flow state, isn't it, when you're sewing, rather than sort of having to stop to read a pattern or double check measurements or whatever. But also the idea of sewing directly onto the batting really appealed to me because it just skips out a step, right? By the time you're done with your quilt topper, you've already also done the quilting part as well. And you could obviously add quilt top stitching if you so desired. One sec, coffee. But I don't think Rachel did. I think she then took her quilt topper and batting and added her lining, and then she turned it into a vest for her soft apocalypse project. I'll link all this in the show notes if you're interested. But yeah, I remember seeing that vest and just finding that whole process really inspiring. She'd made one of these like time-lapse photography videos of her sewing the crumb quilting, and it was just really fun to watch. And I thought that plus the improv quilting course kind of, I guess, a light bulb went off in my brain. So I got all my remnants out and I sorted them sort of, I've got, like wool, denim, velvet, cotton, sort of the things that I sew with most. To be honest, I don't sew that much with velvet anymore, but at the time I had quite a few velvet scraps. And I sort of sorted them into weight, and then just started playing around, really, just making improv little quilted kind of samplers, I guess. And once I got to a big enough piece of fabric, I then cut out 2 rectangles and I made it into a pencil case, which I actually still use. It's just like the perfect size for sort of pens, pencils, little stapler, a Pritt stick, that kind of stuff. And then I thought, well, you could do this as big or as little as you want, right? You could just make little samplers and then turn them into things like project bags or pencil cases, or you could obviously continue going and make something much bigger like a blanket. But if I'm honest, the thought of making a whole blanket felt quite intimidating. Like, that's quite a large piece of fabric, to produce that on a home sewing machine, quilting it all together, I felt like that would be quite a time commitment. But around that time, I remember finding the solo artist, who I think is called Ivy, and it's solo like SEW, because obviously the sewing community loves a sew pun, and I'll link her again in the show notes. And she is a historical costumer, so she sews her own historical costumes, and she's really well informed. Like, she obviously does loads of research before she sews up a costume, and I think from what I've gathered from following her for a while now, she wears these costumes like as her just sort of day-to-day clothes. They're not even really costumes for her, they're just her wardrobe. She lives in Portland, Oregon, and I think she has said in the past that like Portland's probably one of the only places in the world where you could get away with wearing this stuff to like Target, and not get sort of harassment in the street. But yeah, she wears these sort of historical garments every day, and when she makes a new garment, she often does a sort of video breaking down like the history of it, or the sort of interesting facts about sort of the evolution of the women's pocket, or the evolution of the bra, or why women wore bustles, or whatever. And they're really sort of bite-sized little videos that are just very easy to digest. And she has a very nice sort of editing style and a very nice voice to listen to. So yeah, would definitely recommend her. One sec. But one of her projects was a Hobbit Robe inspired by the 2012 version film of The Hobbit. An Unexpected Journey, I think is its tagline. and it was Martin Freeman playing Bilbo Baggins, and in one of the opening scenes where all the dwarves come to Bag End and sort of persuade Bilbo to join them on their adventure, Bilbo's wearing this sort of amazing multicoloured patchwork dressing gown with sort of burgundy velvet cuffs and collar. And it's just, I mean, I don't know much about costume design at all, but to my mind it's like a perfect piece of costume design. Like, it's exactly what I would picture the Hobbits wearing. To put it in context, I have loved The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings since I was about 8 when I first read it. I've read all the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books kind of multiple times through my life, and obviously seen the films and whatnot. But this piece of costume I just thought was perfect. It was exactly what I could imagine a Hobbit wearing. It was very sort of plush, comfortable, like warm, cozy, but also like just that little bit luxurious, you know, but also in a sort of very practical way, you know, like the idea is obviously it would be made with sort of recycled fabrics, sort of thing, reusing fabrics, but like a little bit of quiet luxury there, because Bilbo was sort of one of the fancier of the hobbits, or one of the better educated and more worldly of the hobbits. So it just, I thought, really sort of encapsulated the character of Bilbo Baggins. You could totally imagine him sort of smoking a pipe, drinking a pot of tea, eating a scone, reading a book kind of thing in a sunbeam. And so Ivy had done a kind of a rip-off, I guess, of this piece of costume, and I really loved her version. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, kind of watching all the videos that she put online. She has a YouTube and an Instagram, and I think a TikTok, but I'm not on TikTok. Watching all the videos of her wearing this, and I was just really inspired, and I thought, well, I'm doing this improv quilting course, watching Rachel with the crumb quilting, looking at the fabric scraps that I've got, and I guess just that sort of light bulb moment of, why don't I have a go at this myself, you know? So I started piecing together bigger pieces of fabric, and then quite quickly realised that some of the pieces that I was working with weren't sort of true wool, so when I was trying to press them, they were melting, and I decided I only wanted to work with sort of true wool as much as possible, because this is the kind of project where once it's done, I will hopefully wear it, I mean, potentially for the rest of my life, right? Because it's not like a dressing gown, it's something that wears out that quickly. So yeah, I cut up the sort of pieces that I'd already pieced together, and I reused them to make, like pencil cases and things like that. And then I started again, but just with the wool. And the beauty of this project is it feels, at the risk of sounding a bit grandiose, it feels like wearable art in a way, because it's a piece of wearable personal history, because the fabric scraps were made up of lots of kind of like sentimental pieces of fabric. So I've got wool in there from my granddad's jumpers. My granddad died in about 2018. I've got some wool in there from some cardigans that my mum gave me, that I remember her wearing when I was literally at primary school. There was one that I think was originally from Monsoon, and it was like a Fair Isle cardigan, and she wore that cardigan to death, and then when it died she gave it to me so I could reuse the fabric. And yeah, there's some of that in there. There's some fabric from my parents' dining room chairs that I remember from growing up. There's some fabric from the project bags that I was trying to develop as part of Craft and Thrift before Craft and Thrift sort of shuttered its doors as a shop. So yeah, there's just a lot of sort of like my own personal creative history, I guess, bound up in this fabric that I'm creating. And it just felt like a really nice way to kind of preserve some of those memories, and preserve some of that fabric for potentially, the rest of my life. So I carried on piecing the bits together until I had, I thought, enough fabric to kind of make a dressing gown. And then I found a piece of brushed cotton in my stash. And I went to Deborah of Dastardly Line in Glasgow, so I'll link her in the show notes, but Deborah has a studio in Glasgow where she uses a long arm quilting machine, to create new fabric out of textile waste, and then she makes products out of the textile waste. So she's got this beautiful range of bags that she sells at the V&A in London, that are made from textile waste from the V&A, and she has a range of products made with Johnson of Elgin's cashmere fabric waste. So yeah, she's really interesting, definitely worth following on Instagram, checking out her website. But yeah, she also does just your traditional kind of long arm quilting for home quilters, so you can piece together your quilt top and then take it to Deborah and she'll do the actual quilting of it for you. So that's what I did. I took my quilted wool topper and my brushed cotton. I decided not to put a batting in because the wool was already quite thick, and I thought if I'm going to make a dressing gown with it, I don't want it so thick that I can't sew with it on my home sewing machine. So I took it to her and she quilted it for me, and it's fun because I don't know if she offers this all the time, but I booked to stay with it basically so I could see the whole process from start to finish. So I took some photos, I took some videos. It's just fun to see it being quilted. And I went with a design called topography, which is inspired by the lines drawn on a map that denote sort of hills and valleys and things like that. And I'm really pleased with how the fabric turned out. Yeah, it just looks really smart. And that was about a year ago. I think it might have been February, March time of last year that I got that done. And then my plan was to get it finished, as in sewn up, last year, so that I could wear it over the winter. And then, of course, life comes at you fast, right? Because then I got this job in Inverness, and then we sold our flat in Edinburgh, and then we moved up north, and yes, suddenly like 9 months of the year was gone. And I was making New Year's resolutions for 2025 for my sewing goals, and I thought this has got to be the year that I finally finish the Hobbit Robe, because it's been on my to-do list since 2022, so it's already kind of 3 years in the making, and I'm at the point now where I want to wear it, right? Like I have an actual dressing gown, but it's quite a thin cotton one of the type that is more useful in the summer, really. And I have a sort of, I guess, a house cardie, which is kind of mid-thigh length, so it's quite long, but it's not really enough to kind of, it wouldn't cover you up, you couldn't use it as a modesty robe the way you could with a more traditional dressing gown. So yeah, I don't really feel like I've got anything in my wardrobe that sort of fills this niche, really. And so I just kind of want to get it done so I can actually start wearing it. And now that I live in a house that has a garden as well, there's also part of me that wants to be able to wear it in the garden, wants to be able to come out with the dogs in the morning, just throw a dressing gown on over my pajamas and sort of pot around looking at my plants. So that is my plan. And yeah, suddenly this weekend the inspiration struck. I've finally got my bestie bags finished, so I'm very proud to report that they are off to their new homes and are very gratefully received, which is nice. And I thought, well, better late than never, right? Now is the best time to get something done. So I got the fabric out. Initially I started with the pattern pieces, so I'm using the Sew DIY Tassie robe, which is a draft your own pattern. So it's basically a robe or a dressing gown in 2 different lengths, and you input your body measurements to work out the size of the pattern pieces, and then you cut them yourself. They're basically just rectangles with various angles cut out of them to make the neckline and things like that. So it's a really clever pattern that Beth's sort of developed, because yeah, you could use it for any size or shape of person. Excuse me. Yeah, so I wanted to use that pattern, and I already had it pre-cut out from a different Tassie robe I made in the past. So I got those pattern pieces out and just realised that like it's not long enough. I'd made view B last time and I wanted view A this time. But rather than start from scratch, I input my new body measurements, because my body's changed a bit since I last made this pattern, and then set about sort of altering the pattern pieces. So it was definitely easier than cutting them all from scratch, because I just had to kind of lengthen some and make others slightly wider and that kind of thing. But that was sort of one sort of sewing sessions worth of effort. And then I came back the next day, double checked all my measurements, and then cut out all my pattern pieces, which was terrifying after having spent 3 years putting this piece of fabric together and spending the money on getting it professionally quilted, because, you know, it's not unreasonable what Deborah charges by any means, but, you know, it's over £100 to get a piece of fabric quilted, so I thought it's quite a lot of money to spend on a project if I then mess it up at the last by, you know, messing up the cutting kind of thing. So that was a bit terrifying, but so far so good. I think, touch wood, haven't made any major errors. And then the sewing together of it would be fairly quick, except I'm doing Hong Kong binding, so where you make bias tape. I'm using kimono silk from the kimono remnants that my friend Moira gave me. So I'm cutting out my own bias tape and then binding all of the edges, the inside seam edges, in bias tape, which I think will look really pretty when it's done, and also just be a nice professional way to finish the seams. And again, if I'm going to be wearing this item of clothing for the foreseeable, I just think taking that little bit of extra time to really finish off the seams nicely will definitely pay off in the future. But also, just on a practical note, I didn't think my overlocker would cope with the width of, you know, sort of 2 or even 3 layers of this wool fabric. Trying to bind off those edges with my overlocker, I just didn't think was practical. So far, the Hong Kong binding, I've not done it before, so I watched, actually, Beth from Sew DIY has another video, so I watched that video, and then I watched a few YouTube shorts on it, and it's actually pretty straightforward, and so far seems to be coming together really well. I've only messed up one of the seams where I put the bias on the wrong way round, and then when I tried to rip it off to redo it the right way round, the silk is very fine and the silk was just shredding, so I couldn't easily remove it. So there's one seam where the binding is on the wrong way round, but ultimately I don't think it's going to be overly noticeable. And yeah, now that I'm at the sort of sewing it together part, it's actually coming together really quickly. So I've already done the shoulder seams, attach the sleeves to the body, and then my next step is to bind the side seams with the Hong Kong binding, and then I can sew up the side seams, and then it's basically done. Then it's like hemming. So she has you add cuffs. I eliminated the cuffs because I just thought they would be too heavy in the fabric, so I'm just going to turn the fabric over. I'll probably bind the cuff seam and then just turn it over once and sew it in place. I'm going to have to cut them to length. I purposely made the sleeves too long so that I could cut them to the right length once I'm wearing them. And I've sewn a pocket on, which is in the instructions, but I've done mine on the inside because I didn't want the pocket to detract from the quilting on the outside. But I think the pocket's too small. I don't know if I misread the instructions or if the pocket's supposed to be that small, but it doesn't really look proportional to the robe, so I'm going to make the pockets longer. So I need to rip them off. They should be alright being ripped off because it's the wool fabric on the wool fabric. It's the silk that's quite delicate and rips too easily. So I'm going to remove the pockets, make them longer and reattach them. And then it's got a front neckline facing, a front neckline, which I've done in burgundy wool because I already had it in my stash. I was keen to use my stash as much as possible, not have to buy anything for this project, because that's sort of not in keeping with Hobbits, but also the nature of quilting. And so I already had some burgundy wool in my stash, which is both in the patchwork and I'm going to use it for the neckline, so I think that will make it look more consistent and less sort of Becky Home-ecky. And I need to make the tie as well. So I'm saying, oh, it's coming together really quickly. Now I list it all out loud. There is actually still quite a lot to do. But given that I've been sort of sitting on this project for the best part of 3 years, I'm surprised at how much progress I've made just in like 3 sewing sessions, you know. So I reckon if I can keep the momentum going, I'll probably have it done in the next month, which will be very exciting. And let's face it, there was part of me that wanted it done for winter, but I live in a cold climate. Like, I'll get use out of this all year round, maybe more or less use depending on the time of year, but I'm still going to get use from it, so I don't feel too bad about that. Yeah, so I'm very excited to report back on how I'm getting on with it. And I want to discuss some of the sort of finer points. So I'm reusing old kimono silk, and I would like to write a bit of a deep dive on sort of reusing kimono silk, but also the sort of, I don't know, I'm kind of hesitating on writing this article because I'm a bit like, who am I to have an opinion on this? But I'd like to do a bit more research on sort of reusing kimono material, but also as a kind of privileged white woman, that sort of element of like potentially like cultural appropriation, using fabric that's not part of my cultural heritage. I'd quite like to kind of write a bit about that, just to sort of as part of that process of honouring the fabric that I've been very kindly gifted by my friend Moira. But yeah, I've been pondering on that for quite a while now because it just feels quite potentially controversial and also something I don't really know anything about. So I would have to do quite a lot of research before I wrote the article, and I want to do it justice, you know. So I'm brewing on that at the moment, but in the short term, yeah, very excited with the progress I'm making on this robe. Very excited to share it all with you as it comes together. As ever, I will post all the relevant links and whatnot in the show notes, and I will speak to you all soon. All right, bye.